Well, welcome back. We are continuing our conversation in this series called Foundations. We've been talking through what are the foundations for us as a worship team. These are foundations and beliefs that we hold to, practices we want to outwork within our team. And our heart always is to be a unified team. And if you remember when we did our culture series, we talked about that we have the responsibility to bring unity into this. See, your unity, it comes through agreement, and agreement comes through understanding. It's one thing to be taught something and then to do it. It's another thing to be taught something, begin to actually outwork it. And as I'm taught and outworking this, I really begin to understand it. It's the process of, as I'm learning something and I do it, I understand it more and more and more. So our heart in teaching foundations of worship is for our understanding to be outworked in what it means to truly be a worshiper to God. We began all of this with looking at what Jesus said in John 4:24, but the hour is coming and is now here when what true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth. For the Father is seeking such people to worship him. God is spirit, and those who worship him must worship in spirit and in truth. God is looking for us to live out our lives of worship in spirit and in truth. So we teach this and prioritize this time together because we want to be this kind of worshiper for God. Worshipers who worship him in spirit and in truth. So we've talked through just an understanding of worship from Genesis 22. We've looked at building a history with God in Exodus 33. And what we're going to do on our time together is we're actually going to go to the New Testament. We're going to be in Luke chapter 7, and we'll get there in just a moment. And we are going to look at what it really means to have a heart of worship. Our hearts in worship, they really matter. And here's why. Because our heart is the seat of desire. A heart of worship is the seat of desire within worship, right? What's at the center of my desires when it comes to worship? What's really there? What's motivating me? Remember, when we talked about understanding worship, we talked about how there's a sacrifice that takes place. There's a submission. There's a cost to this. It's about giving our all to God. Romans 12. I appeal to you, therefore, brothers, by the mercies of God, to do what? Present your bodies as what? Living sacrifices, holy and acceptable to God, which is your true and spiritual act of worship. Paul is saying, give all you have to God. Give your whole self to him. Give your whole heart to him. So here's just a thought just to mull over as we talk through this together. The extent to which Jesus has changed my life is the extent to which I will love him. To put it in a corporate setting, the extent to which Jesus has changed our lives is the extent in which we will love him. If Jesus hasn't truly changed your life, you're never going to love him well. And we serve the things that we love, and we love what we place value on. As in the things we place value on, that's where it's seen with our love. Another way of saying it is what we love are the things that we worship. We can serve Jesus without worshiping him. But we can never worship him without serving him. Every single one of us, we can serve Jesus without worshiping him. But we can never worship him without serving him. So what does a heart of worship look like? What are we being called to as worshipers when it comes to giving God the seat of our desires? Luke chapter 7, we're going to look at a few verses here. And this is a story, it's called Jesus is anointed by a sinful woman or an adulterous woman, depending on the translation. And the story goes like this. Luke 7, verse 36. One of the Pharisees asked Jesus to have dinner with him. So Jesus went to his home and he sat down to eat. And when a certain immoral woman from the city heard that he was eating there, she brought a beautiful alabaster jar filled with expensive perfume. Then she knelt down at his feet, weeping, and her tears fell on his feet, and she wiped them off with her hair. Then she kept kissing his feet and putting perfume on them. Then the Pharisee who had invited him saw this. He said to himself, if this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman is touching him. She is a sinner. Then Jesus answered his thoughts. Simon, he said to the Pharisee, I have something to say to you. Go ahead, teacher, Simon replied. Then Jesus told him this story. A man loaned money to two people, 500 pieces of silver to one and 50 pieces of silver to another. But neither of them could repay him. So he kindly forgave them both, canceling their debts. Who do you suppose loved him more after that? Simon answered, I suppose the one who canceled the larger debt. Jesus said, that's right. Then he turned to the woman and said to Simon, look at this woman kneeling here. When I entered your home, you didn't offer me water to wash the dust from my feet, but she's washed them with tears and wiped them with her hair. You didn't greet me with a kiss, but from the time I first came in, she's not stopped kissing my feet. You neglected the courtesy of olive oil to anoint my head, but she's anointed my feet with rare perfume. I tell you, her sins, and they are many, have been forgiven, for she has shown so much love. But a person who has been forgiven little shows little love. Then Jesus said to the woman, your sins are forgiven. The men at the table said among themselves, who is this man that he goes around forgiving sins? And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you. Go in peace. What does it look like to have a heart of worship based on this story? How do we do this? How do we see this? And here's what we see. A heart of worship begins by bringing something of worth. A heart of worship, it will always bring something of worth. This woman, and we don't know her name, all we know is what's said of her is she was a sinful woman, an immoral woman, but she actually brings something of worth. She brought something. It cost her. When I have a heart of worship and I'm stepping in, it says that this, I understand this will cost me. Cost her dignity, her pride. It cost her the potential of being thrown out. We're talking about a culture where women were somewhat looked down upon. In this setting, Jesus would have been sitting there with men. All of the women were either serving them or they were up in the atrium area looking down on them. And so they were removed from that setting. A heart of worship brings something as worth. She steps in this moment, and it's going to cost her. It's going to cost her being talked about, this act of worship in this way. There's so many things that I love about this story. And what I really love is what it says is she brought an alabaster jar filled with what? Expensive perfume. She brought something that was worth something to her. There's a question. What are you bringing? When you come to meet with Jesus, what are you bringing? What are you bringing into this moment? She comes prepared. She comes ready. And I think it's so easy for us to start going through the motions and forgetting the importance of this. She didn't just bring anything. She brought something of worth. When you step into our gatherings, when you step into lead, are you saying, my heart posture in this moment is, I might not feel like this is much to give, but it's all I have to give. And I'm going to leave it. I'm just going to bring it. I'm just going to say, God, I'm willing to do this. A heart of worship always brings something of worth. The second thing that we see is a heart of worship pours it all out. So it wasn't just that she brought it, she actually begins to pour it out, and she pours all of it out. She gave it all. She didn't hold anything back. A lot of times when it comes to leading and it comes to what we do and it comes to serving people, if we're honest, we do hold things back. We're a little bit reserved. We kind of just sit back on our heels at times and we're just like, I got to save some energy. I got to save some. I have more going on after this. And I love her heart posture because she just says, I'm going to bring something of worth. It's going to cost me in this moment, but I'm going to pour it all out. A heart of worship doesn't give out of comfort, convenience, or compulsion. A heart of worship gives out of conviction. Comfort says, stay safe. People may judge you. People may make fun of you. People may not accept you. But a heart of worship doesn't give out of comfort. It doesn't give out of convenience or compulsion. It gives out of conviction. A heart of worship says, I'm going to pour myself out and be uncomfortable because Jesus poured himself out and lived an uncomfortable life. Convenience says it's easy. When I have time, I'll do this. Right? When my life is less busy, I'll step into this. It operates of worship in the attitude of convenience, if this works for me. But a heart of worship says, I'm willing for my life to be interrupted and for this to be an inconvenience, for this to potentially be awkward, and ultimately I'm willing to give it all. And compulsion says others are doing it because I'm in this moment and feel it, because others are responding to Jesus in this way, I should, because someone else told me to do it. Compulsion is a poor way to live our life. It's a poor way to live out of a place of worship to God. A heart of worship says, I lead myself to respond to the revelation of who Jesus is. I'm not doing this just because others are. I'm responding to the revelation of Jesus. So a heart of worship brings something of worth and it pours it all out. It just says, here you go, God. Use this. So she brought something of worth. She gave it all. The third thing that we see is the heart of worship stays in a posture of worship. The heart of worship really stays in a posture of worship. She stayed at the feet of Jesus. Just imagine this scene of Jesus there. And he's at this table sharing this meal with a Pharisee. And a Pharisee was one of the religious leaders of the day. So one, it was just supposed to be men that were present. Not only that, she's marked as being a sinful and immoral woman. Like, people know her dirty laundry. People know the life that she has lived. The heart of worship stays in the posture of worship. She stayed at the feet of Jesus. Just think of how uncomfortable and awkward that setting was, of Jesus just sitting there and her taking this alabaster jar of perfume and pouring it out, and her just sobbing and wiping Jesus' feet, and everyone's like, I have no idea what's going on in this moment. And she just stayed there. She just stayed at the feet of Jesus. She really didn't care what people were thinking. She didn't care the judgment that was going on. She didn't care about the shade being thrown away. She was just like, I'm staying here. She wasn't quick to move and go on to the next thing. She wasn't quick to say, I showed up, I did my part, check mark. She stayed in a posture of worship at the feet of Jesus. She was kissing him, remaining close to him, displaying her affection for him. The heart of worship always carries a continual posture of worship. It remains in the moment. If you will, it is continually kissing the feet of Jesus. Be willing to stay in those moments, to be present in those moments, for your heart to say, my desire in this moment is just to be here. As we talked about with our culture of passion, that David said, one thing I ask the Lord, the thing that I seek the most is to dwell in the house of the Lord all the days of my life, gazing upon his beauty. That's a heart of worship. That's a posture of saying, I will stay in this moment at the feet of Jesus and worship him. So we just see this woman responding this way. And the Pharisee's name was Simon. And Simon had invited him. And he has this thought. He says, if this man were a prophet, he would know what kind of woman this is. She's a sinner. Because rabbis, religious leaders, they weren't meant to be touched by sinners. There was meant to be a distance and a separation there. But Jesus also understood, no, I get that this woman is a sinner. I understand who she is. And the best thing that can happen in her life is her getting close to me and posturing herself at my feet. And so Simon thinks this, and Jesus answered his thoughts. He doesn't even say anything. And he tells that parable of the money lender lending. Asks the question, who do you suppose loved him more after that? Simon, as suppose the one whom he canceled the larger debt. Jesus said, that's right. That's right. I tell you, her sins are many. They've been forgiven. And he says this, she has been forgiven much, so she loves much. But a person who's been forgiven little only loves a little. There's a point. The extent to which Jesus has changed my life is the extent in which I will love him. And this woman's life was radically changed by encountering Jesus. She came with the heart of worship and she put it on display because she understood what she had been forgiven of. And as we had talked about in understanding worship and there being a blessing in worship, there's a blessing for her in this moment. And we'll get to that. But we need to understand the tension of why don't we see more, why don't we see just a beauty and a posturing of ourselves in worship in this way? The way that this woman, that she came, that she brought something of worth, that she poured it all out and she stayed in a posture of worship. Why don't we always see that? And I think in part it's because we forget what we have been forgiven of. As Jesus said, I tell you, her sins, and they are many, have been forgiven. So she has shown me much love. But a person who's forgiven little only shows a little love. Why aren't our gatherings more saturated with our love pouring out to the heart of Jesus? And it's partly because we honestly, if we're God honest, we think we're good people. Like, we think because we go to church, because this is who my family is, because I read my Bible, because I tithe, because I serve, whatever it is, I'm a good person, I'm a good Christian. And we begin to convince ourselves that we know we need the love of God and the forgiveness of God, but we don't really understand what we've really been, how we've been loved, and our own, in this moment, everything that God's forgiven us of. Why don't we see more? Because I think we've forgotten truly what it means that sin doesn't make us bad, but sin makes us dead. And Jesus doesn't make us good, but Jesus makes us alive. And if I've gone from death to life in the name of Jesus by his finished work on the cross, then I have this revelation that I will love him in this way and I will pour myself out in this way. A heart of worship saying that. The extent in which Jesus has changed my life is the extent that I will express my love to him. Is your worship seen in the way you love him? Do you bring something of worth? Do you give it all and do you stay in a posture of worship? Here's the blessing. He forgives the woman's sins, which is such a great blessing. And Jesus said to the woman, your faith has saved you, go in peace. This adulterous woman walks out with the blessing of Jesus spoken out of her life. Not only that, remember she poured something that cost her. She poured it on Jesus' feet and she took her hair and she wiped his feet with it. That meant that wherever Jesus walked, people would smell that perfume, and wherever that woman went, they would smell the same thing. The fragrance of worship is contagious in our life. When we step in and we give something to Jesus, what we offer in this moment, God says, look, this will mark your life. And so as Jesus walked out of that room, the same fragrance he carried is the same fragrance that marked this woman's life. We will forever be marked by the presence of Jesus when we learn that this is a heart of worship. And this is how we posture ourselves before him. A heart of worship. It brings something of worth, it pours it out, and then it stays in a posture of worship. Do you live out? Do you honestly live out what it means to have a heart of worship? This is foundational for us because everything that we do in acts of service comes from this. It comes from saying, I want to have a heart of worship in this moment. I want to